everyone. Hello. Welcome to this live event presented by Mother Jones Magazine. My name is Samantha, and I'm a reporter here at Mother Jones in California. And I know today is a pretty heavy day for a lot of us as we grapple with the latest news in Breonna Taylor's case in Kentucky. But as I try to reflect on what's happened and what the next steps are in the fight for justice, I'm really glad to be here today with our guests, Ben and Mike McBride. So Ben and Mike are brothers and community organizers who are known here in Oakland for their work that they've done to reduce gun violence. And I first reached out to Ben about a year ago when I started working on an article about shootings here in Oakland. And I wanted to catch up with him and with his brother Mike today, because I think they share a really interesting perspective as brothers, as faith leaders, and as activists who have done a lot of work to kind of pave the way for this current movement to defund police. And through their work on gun violence, they've helped show that it's totally possible to scale back law enforcement and scale back arrests while also reducing violence and crime. And the secret to doing that has been investing in social services. So that's what they've pushed to do in Oakland through a gun violence reduction project that they have helped launch. They connected young men in gangs and street groups with life coaches, and shootings in the city fell by about half. And now cities around the country are sending officials here to learn more about the strategy. But before we dig into the details, I just want to share a little bit more about the McBrides and the organizations that they work with. So Pastor Mike helps lead Faith in Action, which is a faith-based group that addresses gun violence and also the mass incarceration of young people of color. And he was invited by the Obama administration to help out with a few task forces that dealt with racial justice and police community relations, among other issues. And Reverend Ben is the co-director of Pico, California, which is another grassroots group that does a ton of racial justice work. And he recently founded a campaign called Bring the Heat, which calls for sweeping changes to policing across the US. So welcome, Mike. Welcome, Ben. So glad to have you both here. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to be
here. Glad to be here.
So I guess let's get started and talk about what's on a lot of people's minds right now, which is Breonna Taylor in Kentucky. Yesterday, the state attorney general announced that there were going to be no murder charges filed against the police officers who killed her. Ben, I had heard that you've actually visited Kentucky recently, so I was wondering if you could kind of react to the latest news and also tell us what's the mood like on the ground there right now?
Well, I think this is just yet another episode of what we've continued to see since, our eyes became more open to this over the last decade with all of the blood being spilled in the street, and particularly that from law enforcement. I think the mood on the ground in Louisville is deep pain and deep lament, deep hurt. For over 120 days, young, poor Black people have protested and put their bodies in the street to merely call for their basic human rights to be recognized and justice for Breonna Taylor being murdered while she lay in her home. And I was in Louisville in June when young people, both folks from the community as well as activists came from the outside, and was also there again for Good Trouble Tuesday in August. And the mood on the ground was deep hope and aspiration that some justice might come to their situation with the obviously racist structure that is set in place. And as I've talked with folks back and forth on the ground over the last 18 hours, maybe 24 hours now, people are just heartbroken. People feel that the efforts that we try to continue to call people towards around peaceful protests and around voting just seem to fall on deaf ears because people are experiencing that the blood of Black people being spilled by the state that is supposed to protect them simply does not matter. And the failure of the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, and his vicious response and his vicious press conference yesterday to even somehow suggest that it is the fault of Breonna Taylor or the fault of her boyfriend who did what he should have done to protect her life when they felt they were under the threat of people breaking into their house, and they didn't think it. They obviously were under that threat. For him to stand up and give the kind of press conference that he did was just disgusting. And it just continues to leave Black people in a very vulnerable place in this American system.
And I definitely want to talk more about what the next steps are in this fight for justice. I know your family has been fighting for racial justice for a long time. And I had read actually that your dad met Martin Luther King Jr. when he was a boy and had been arrested during the civil rights movement. So I'm curious, Mike, if you can talk about what personally led you to want to focus on the issue of gun violence in particular in your work?
Well, obviously, just on the heels of my brother's comments, it is a reality that violence disproportionately finds the bodies of Black people, Black communities, even when we are not looking for it. I was a youth pastor in San Jose in 1999, and even though I had grown up and we both grew up in San Francisco during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, so we're not strangers to the reality of life in the neighborhood, in spaces and places where systems have radically failed Black people. By the grace of God and our parents and a lot of love, luck, and fortune, we were able to make it through and navigate that. But we did see death. We did see addiction. We did see violence by community members towards one another and also by the police. I myself was physically and sexually assaulted by 2 San Jose police officers in 1999. And while I was dealing with that ordeal, as a youth pastor, as a Bible college student, I remember having conversations with the young people in my church group, and they told me this happened to them all of the time. And I said, well, why did you never come and say this to us? And this changed my life. It changed the work that I was planning to do as a minister. They said, we did not think this part of our life was something the church would respond to. And it made me ask myself the question, what is it about the work that I do that these parents and even the children will trust me with the salvation of their souls, but not the safety of their bodies? It is indeed a fact that the work we do cannot just be about esoteric, altruistic campaigns and movements. These are literal bodies being placed on the line that are being lost to preventable violence, whether it is neighbor-to-neighbor violence, whether it is the violence of the state through police officers, whether it is the violence of policy that assaults the imago Dei, the image of God in every single person. That is really what propelled me. My own victimization forced me to open up my eyes. Prayerfully, the tender heart that was cultivated by my parents, my father, making us watch Eyes on the Prize every February, making us watch Roots. We didn't even know that we were being prepared to hear the cries of our people with a tender heart. All of that together has really compelled me and my brother, and I think many of us, to not turn away in this moment, but stand up and be unrelenting, be unapologetic by insisting that Black people and our lives and our bodies and our communities are not subject to arbitrary violence at the hands of the state. And that's what we plan and will continue to do.
Okay. And before we jump into talking about Oakland specifically, Mike, given everything you just said, do you have any reflections that you want to share on Breonna and her case in Kentucky?
Well, you know, this is another expression of wickedness in high places. Daniel Cameron is a Black man who stood up before the world and attempted to erase the death of a Black woman that was preventable. He took on the cause of a law enforcement apparatus that for at least the last decade or so have threatened Black people, have through their unions disparaged Black young people attempting to reach for justice. He became a darling of Donald Trump. And so his credibility is permanently damaged. And I despise any Black man who would stand up before the public and attempt to make sense of the death of Black people and not hold the culprits responsible. Shame on Cameron, and shame on anyone who believes that that is their role in this system, to continue to explain away the death of Black people. People must be held accountable. People should at least admit they made a mistake, and they should with integrity say that my mistake has cost the life of a woman who should not be dead. But we don't even have individuals willing to stand up and form their lips to say that.
Mhm.
This is an outrage, and you should be outraged. And God help all of you who mute your voices because you are attempting to curry favor with those who do not understand the legitimacy of Black outrage in this moment. This Black woman should be alive. The officers who shot her should be at least in jail. And we should not be having to relive nightmares like this every single week and month while the system tells us to march around in circles and chant and protest until they bring out police officers to crack us upside the head, shoot us with rubber bullets, and tear gas us. This is not the way that Black people should live in this country. And as you can see, I am fired up about it. I'm very upset. I'm hurt. My heart is broken. And I hope that many more people in this country channel the rage the same way that we are hoping to do by being a part of the solution. It is an outrage.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Mike. And Ben, I see you've been nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult for us to be in moments like this, doing the work that we do, because you see sometimes so up close and personal how unrighteous this system is. And when people will say, well, why don't you all try to find ways to build relationship with police and find ways to build trust with them and to do partnership with them. We have done all that kind of work in the past, and they have continued to prove themselves that the greatest liability to our community's public safety is the police themselves. It is their unrighteous unions, it is the cowardice in their leadership, and it is the inability for them within their own cultures to call out the racist and xenophobic and homophobic behaviors that they have going on in their own cultures. And so my hope in moments like this is that we somehow we would wake up in the American public. I continue to ask myself, how much Black blood is it going to take for this country to recognize that it needs to do something about its wicked way of being? How much blood is it going to take for us to wake up and say that the policing apparatus that we have is not broken, it is working in the way in which it was designed, and it totally needs to be deconstructed, and we need to reconstruct the same way they did after they abolished slavery. We need to reconstruct not another policing system, but a new public safety apparatus that is full of many of the strategies we've seen work and strategies that we have yet to create. But this current system will only create more Breonna Taylors, more George Floyds, more Michael Browns, Oscar Grants, Renisha McBrides, Tamir Rices, and Sandra Bland. They will continue to create these outcomes. And so my hope is that the American public does not get used to Black bodies, because we know that if we saw white bodies and white people being crushed under the brutality of the American state, the public would not sit by quiet. I'm glad people are protesting, but it's going to take a lot more for us to change these brutal conditions that Black people have been forced to live under for the last 400 years.
It's so true. Thank you, Ben. So you mentioned getting to work. Let's talk about some of that work, especially in Oakland. So as I mentioned earlier, shootings here have dropped by about 50% over several years. Mike, what was the secret to that? How did the strategy work?
Well, I always believe that the secret to any successful strategy is collaboration. It is the ability for people to take their unique roles and to be honest about the limitations of what they bring and be curious about the gifts that others bring to the table. The city of Oakland, where we currently live, we are from San Francisco, but because of colonization that is now called gentrification, we can't afford to live there anymore. So we live in the eastern part of the city of Oakland, East Oakland, as we call it. We realized that the data told us that less than 1%, half of 1% of the city's population drives over 60% of the violence, particularly related to gun-related shootings and homicides. And that there were strategies that we were familiarized with because of mentors like Reverend Eugene Rivers, Reverend Jeffrey Brown, Tenny Gross, Erica Ford, the list goes on and on. People who have in their cities reduced gun violence without having to grow their police departments. As a matter of fact, they've reduced gun violence, and as the Boston experience tells us, they de-racialized the law enforcement's interaction with Black young people in the Dorchester neighborhoods. And so we said, why not do this in Oakland? Why not do this in Sacramento? Why not do this in Stockton? Why not do this in parts of the state and the country where we have footprints and organizers and clergy who are willing to learn a new strategy. And so we trained clergy and others in Oakland. We connected with young men who were caught in the cycles of violence. We got technical assistance providers like the California Partnership, David Muhammad and Reagan Harmon, who was already working out of the mayor's office, and we helped to build a coalition to implement these strategies. It took a lot of work. It still takes a lot of work, but the work paid off. After a couple of years, we were able to see a 30% reduction, and my brother can go deep down the rabbit hole around the other kind of impacting efforts that led to the drop in police shootings. But I will say this, it took an imagination that was bigger than the current realities we faced. We had to convince ourselves, the police, and even community members that Pookie's life was worth saving, not arresting, not shooting, but worth saving. And once we got around to acknowledging that the lives of young Black men were worth saving, even while they were caught in cycles of violence, we began to do the kinds of works and strategies and investments that were certainly connected to that assumption. And I think the first step for all of us who want to have these results, we have to have a reimagination. We have to have a conversion. We always say the first revolution is an internal one. That is the first step for the success that we seek.
That's so interesting. And Ben, do you want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit more about what are some of the specifics and the strategy that led to these key impacts?
Well, I felt like Mike dug the rabbit hole pretty deep. And I was going to go down the rabbit hole. I was like, I feel like the tunnel is pretty carved out. But I mean, on a serious note, what it took was a lot of collaboration. It took a lot of bridging across difference, not just, with community members and the city's apparatus, but even within our own community constructs. It took faith partners. It took people who were not religious. It took formerly incarcerated folks. It took people who had been victims of violence, all getting together, putting not just our minds together, but our hearts together and our time together to actually put a strategy in place that would lead to the kinds of results. But one of the biggest things that I think is important, that was actually a big learning for me about the whole strategy to reduce violence, was that the way to do so was not about enforcement with law enforcement or incarceration. It was actually communication, and it was resources. That when we would sit down, and to take y'all a little bit into what this work looked like, every 2 to 3 months, we would fill a room with young brothers who had been shooting at each other across the city. And we would sit them around a big table that had 25 to 30 people sitting around it. We'd have one of our young brothers sitting there, and then we might have a mother who had lost her child to violence. Then we'd have another young brother who had been shooting, and we'd have a faith leader. And then another young brother who had been shooting, and we'd have a formerly incarcerated person who had changed their life, and another brother who had been shooting. And maybe we'd have a law enforcement person, could be a district attorney, could be a U.S. attorney. We had a couple police officers in the room. But for an hour or two, we would have conversation with the young men. We would talk to them about their lives. We would tell them that we cared about them, that we loved them. We would admit that the reason that they were in their current condition was because we failed them as adults in their community to keep them safe. We failed them with poor schools. We failed them with giving them adequate health care for mental and emotional trauma. They were the survivors of the crack epidemic. So we admitted our failure, our culpability in their own situation. And then we offered them our help, our time, our heart, and our resources to help them transition out. And it was that consistent communication that happened with them in those rooms. There would be times that we would get individuals that we knew were at a high risk to either commit an act of violence or be a victim of violence. And we do individual meetings with them and say, hey, we're recognizing that you're in a situation right now. We love you. We care about you. What can we do to help you make a different life choice and get in a different situation? And what we found that 70% of the time when we had the conversations with these young brothers, they would opt out of the violence themselves. I remember one specific conversation I was having with a brother, and I said, how come you haven't got out of the violence already? And he literally said to me, no one has ever asked me to, and actually committed themselves to walk with me on that journey. And so in essence, what he was telling me is, I don't just need a job. I need human beings who are willing to see me as more than what I've done and what I've participated in. And what we found over and over is that when we were willing to communicate with these individuals and wrap services around them and community around them, that's what led to the decrease in violence. And so I think it's always important for us to recognize that the only people who can stop the violence in communities are the young men themselves. And they have the power to do so. They've showed us that they will do so. The question is, are we willing to commit ourselves to change the conditions that make it less likely for them in their current state to make different choices? The onus is not on them, it's really on us.
That's so interesting. And so the strategy has had all this success in Oakland, but the pandemic, it seems, is kind of complicating things a little bit. I had read that shootings are starting to rise in Oakland and also in a lot of other cities in the past few months. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I saw that in Oakland, shootings were up by about 55% this spring and summer. So Mike, I'm curious, what are some reasons for that, do you think? And does this trend worry you?
Well, I think what's so fascinating about this attempt to connect the rise of shootings to the failure of the strategies that we know work is the kind of law and order framework that even progressive cities, quote unquote, are too easily seduced into to explain away what we know is actually at the root of what is happening. COVID-19. I don't know if anyone has heard of the coronavirus. I don't know if anyone has heard that we have a global pandemic that has literally been mismanaged at the highest level. And so you may have heard this before, that when the country has a cold, the Black community has the flu. The social ills that are pre-existing in our communities that are usually related to not just the violence that is interpersonal, but the violence that is related to lack of mental health supports, lack of on-ramping into jobs and opportunities, the incarceration and lack of re-entry into our communities upon folks' release. All of these things were pre-existing this pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, many of our cities deemed outreach workers as essential workers, but they did not give them PPE to continue to go out in the community and do the interruption work. They slashed their budgets and did not give us any of the resources to be able to continue the case management work. And so, of course, if the strategies are the reasons why the violence has been reduced and a global pandemic hit and we can no longer do the strategies, then you will find that people revert into hopelessness. And we must continue to invite ourselves to not see violence in Black communities as disconnected from the national social realities that people are dealing with every single day. We have to have the courage to say that the reason why violence seems to be persisting in our communities is because poverty persists, is because the systemic bias of systems in this country persists, because we still have unaccountable law enforcement folks in this country, and they still exist. These, I think, are more credible reasons to connect to the reasons why we have seen some spikes in violence. I guarantee you, if we funded and resourced these strategies at the level they have been in the past, we would see a different result. But that requires a certain kind of political will that just doesn't currently exist, even among progressives.
Absolutely. I mean, Mike is 100% right. It's all about conditions. It is the conditions that are creating the uptick in violence because of the overexposure of the COVID-19 pandemic in our communities. And I think it's really important for us to really start getting an analysis around why we are criminalizing the effects of poverty instead of criminalizing the conditions of poverty themselves, right? So we will criminalize how people are reacting when they are put in this vulnerable position rather than criminalizing the conditions that create that kind of vulnerability. It is a lack of resourcing that we have that the COVID-19 pandemic is just revealing. It's revealing that our, health safety net for our loved ones who've been impacted by violence was already stretched thin. That when we've got love, that it shows the dependence that our loved ones had of having violence interrupters walking their streets doing conflict resolution on a daily basis. And when you remove those individuals from the community and you still have the police, then you see violence go up. What is that proof of? It's proof that the presence of the police do not create peace. It is actually the presence of peacemaking individuals, bridging individuals who actually are in communication with people who are surviving the conditions of poverty. That's what leads to peace. And so our ability to resource that is really our solution. It's what we found in ceasefire. And even, you know, a lot of times when we were first scaling up the strategy in Oakland, we didn't always have the support of progressive elected officials to want to put their money towards this. I mean, I know we're always criticizing people on the right, and justifiably so, because of the very racist, misogynistic, xenophobic ways that they are creating public policy. But even folks on the political left at times lack the imagination to actually believe that Black and brown people talking to other Black and brown people will create peace, that they need white people in blue uniforms armed to come into people of color's neighborhood, and particularly Black people's neighborhoods, in order to have the presence of peace. And so COVID-19 is showing that more and more. And I think it's really calling on us really having a serious conversation about how do we resource peace in our communities instead of being so, you know, conditioned to accept, you know, violence and armed strangers in the name of the state preserving some kind of safety in the community, which the data continues to show us is not happening.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I want to talk more about that because obviously, in addition to the pandemic, we're in the middle of this revolution to rethink policing and public safety in the United States. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how this revolution is affecting the gun violence strategy in Oakland specifically, because even though the strategy focuses a lot on social services, I know historically it has involved the police to a certain extent. So Ben, I'm curious, do you think that the police are a necessary part of the strategy like they've been historically, or do you think it's possible to roll back the extent to which they're involved in Oakland?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that having a public safety apparatus is necessary in order to provide security in cities. But the current policing systems we have are not public safety apparatuses. They are paramilitary structures that operate as systems of violence. They operate as warriors. They self-describe themselves as that rather than guardians of the community. So for us, you know, we're pragmatic and Black people are pragmatic. We have never had the opportunity to live in the conditions that we've wanted. We've always had to live in the conditions that we have. So currently right now, the police are the system endorsed by the state to provide public safety, as flawed as they are. So we have to figure out, how do we extract the most we can out of an obviously failing system to help be a part of the way in which we create peace in our communities, and how do we figure out how to, you know, put some handles on our policing system? How do we find ways to reduce the harm that they bring to our communities while ensuring that they can contribute, for whatever we can extract out of them, the kinds of support that we need in order to implement our strategies. So our strategies have included police as a part of this strategy, but what it's been has been for police to be at the table, not in a leadership role, but rather in a role that is allowing us to prioritize our communication strategies, our support strategies, and simply being, you know, what we oftentimes call the carrot and the stick in a strategy. That after all of our communication and our resource strategies have failed, if we have individuals who are still so sick from the effects that they have been placed in because of poverty, that they are more likely to take the life of another individual in the community, the police are used as a last resort to remove that individual from the community until we can get a better public safety apparatus to be put in its place. But I do believe that our strategy is helping us to recognize what kind of systems we need to erect that ultimately allow us to abolish this system of policing. And yes, I said abolish the system of policing. I mean, people have told me, you got that collar on. How can you be talking about abolish the police? I said, if you've been catching the hell that Black people have been catching in this country for the last 400 years, and if you knew that the policing system was simply a child of the slave patrol system that was put in place 400 years ago to organize terror against Black people so they wouldn't run away, to use excessive force to gain compliance, and to chase down runaway slaves, if you knew that to be the history of police departments, you would join me in the chorus of saying we need to create something new. I am saying we need to abolish this system, but we need to reconstruct a new system. And so our strategies are telling us that what would it look like if instead of calling the police to come into communities, you could call an emergency service in your city, and we had 200 to 300 community members, these violence interrupters, who could show up as nonviolent, peaceful, people who would come in and dissolve conflict in communities instead of calling the police. We've already seen the results and the impact of that and the strategies that we've helped to be a part of. But we don't need 20 to 30 of those people. We need 200 to 300 of those people. We need to take money that right now is in the police department and scale up our mental health services so that we could have people who are in mental crises, have folks respond in their communities. A lot of the communal violence and the neighbor-to-neighbor gun violence that happens also because of mental health challenges. We oftentimes don't see Pookie and Ray Ray as mentally challenged people who are surviving the trauma that has happened for years in their lives. They need mental health support. What would it look like if we had 100 to 200 mental health responders that could show up? And then we could figure out who are the last 200 to 300 people in a city that may need to respond to situations that nonviolent de-escalation efforts will not work for. Those are the kinds of strategies that we're wanting to put forward. And that's why we've come up with the acronym HEAT to think about hiring, equipment, accountability, and training. It came out of our gun violence reduction work. We've been trying to figure out for the last 10 years, how do we reduce the footprint of law enforcement, scale up more of these other kinds of resources, and then build a new public safety apparatus that hires the people we want, has them use the tactics and tools that we want in community, a system that wants to be accountable to the community, and then how do we train those folks to deliver constitutional security to citizens that are in our neighborhoods. That's the kind of work we've been doing, and those are the kind of reforms we are trying to work on while we are on our way to abolishing this current system and reconstructing something else.
And let's keep talking about this movement to abolish police and demand accountability. So I know, Mike, that the two of you have been working on this movement for a long time, and that you both went to Ferguson back in 2014 to protest there. And so how would you compare the movement then in Ferguson with the movement that's developing now after the death of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd?
Yeah, I think all these movements are just continuation of the movements and efforts that were before them. None of us are ahistorical. We are learning, literally, every new uprising learns from the uprising before it, including Ferguson. Uncle Bobby and many of the loved ones from Oakland showed up in Ferguson on the heels of the killing of Michael Brown. I can think of the young people from Florida, Phil Agnew, Charlene Carruthers out of Chicago, some of the BYP 100 folks. Obviously, some of the Black Lives Matter folks showed up. So no uprising happens in a vacuum. The brilliance of the young people who literally transformed people like myself and my brother, Tef Poe, Rika, T-Dub, Tori, Ashley, on and on and on and on. That conversion moment for us informed our work as well. We were known across the country as practitioners of reducing gun violence in urban communities. We came out of Ferguson realizing that we have to add a whole nother component that made sure our reduction of gun violence in urban communities was also tied to the reduction of police violence. Because if you have unconstitutional policing, then it breeds lawlessness. And right now we have police officers who are unwilling to be accountable. They are protected by certain Supreme Court rulings that allow them to lie on police reports about threats that they perceive that may or may not be real. We have unions that protect them. We have people who often elected officials are unwilling to push back against the overreach of law enforcement in budgets all across the country. We have police departments that are averaging almost $2 or $3 million per year of payouts of the taxpayers' dollars to settlements because they use too much violence that is unconstitutional and excessive. So all of these realities came to the front of our minds as we were in Ferguson. And so I just want to continue to assert that none of us do this work in a vacuum. We call it Black Lives Matter today, but, 20 years ago, there was another popular phrase that was used to call on police to stop shooting and killing folks. And 30 and 40 years ago, there was another way to speak about it. And so these movements, they are cumulative in nature. There's the 300-year movement for the ending of the state-sanctioned killing of Black people in this country, of the abuse of Black folks in this country. And we keep learning. We keep striving. We keep working and building a coalition of the willing. And I do think that one of the greatest blessings of this current moment, as we said, even the protest earlier this year started out as a rocky road protest. Now we got 31 flavors. Everybody's outside demonstrating their commitment to the protection and safety of Black folks. Now we need that coalition to translate into voting at the local, state, and federal level, not as the silver bullet, but certainly as a way to ensure that we begin to get a political momentum towards ensuring that governance, which is the key here. I mean, part of what we learned in Oakland is governance matters. How you govern matters. It's not just how you vote, it's how you govern. And so we must govern in ways that demonstrate the prioritization of the saving of Black people's lives. And I think when we can push progressives to govern in ways that prioritize the safety of Black people's lives, then our budgets will change. Then our priorities will change. We won't hear rhetoric that is not attached to budgets. And I think that is the next frontier of the work that we have to do. It is now a budget fight in all of our cities across the country. We must fight for the budgets of taxpayers to be moved into peacemaking work, public health related work, and not the kind of overinvestment in punitive criminalization and policing responses to the hurt of Black people and poor people in this country.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike is totally right too. And I really think I just want to, underscore one of the points that he lifted up around us not always being there with our own analysis, because I know people might be watching and sometimes you're hearing some new things and you're trying to take this and put it in the analysis that you already have. But this is a continuum and we're all learning from these different moments. And when you learn and you know better, then you should do better. I mean, pre-Ferguson, I had young brothers in Oakland who told me in 2014 that the Oakland Police Department was involved in sexual orgies and activities with women in the community. And I've told this story that I myself, with my underdeveloped analysis, did not believe them. I thought that they were being extreme, that they were somehow making something up, only to find out 2 years later that the Oakland Police Department the scandal broke that they were trafficking a young brown child in our community. And that was a failure on my part to believe these young Black men who were telling me then what was happening. Then I went to Ferguson. I had my eyes awakened in a different way. And I learned that I needed to believe what young Black people were saying was happening to them in their community, what the police were doing to them, why they were engaging in vigilante justice because of the failure of the police to provide constitutional security. So I just want to say to all of us that might be finding yourselves awakening in this post-George Floyd moment and Breonna Taylor moment, we need to believe what the people closest to the pain are telling us. They are not lying. And then when we vote, as Mike was talking about, I believe that in a democracy like ours that has been riddled by white supremacy and structural racism, those with privilege should not vote your own interests. you should vote the interests of the most marginalized around you. So what would it look like for you to vote with Pookie's interests in mind, with Pookie's situatedness in mind? When you get to the budget, you are not trying to get the budget designed for your interests, but rather for the interests of these who have been ignored. It's this kind of journey that we're going to have to go on if across race, across class, across geography, across experience, we're really going to create a community where everybody can belong, not just those who've been privileged.
It's so true. Thanks, Ben. And so let's talk more about voting in the election then. Are there other ways that you think that the movement and allies should be shifting attention or priorities in relation to the upcoming election that we should all be paying attention to? What about you, Mike?
I think people are doing the best that we can to get folks to the polls. I mean, what we are experiencing right now, though, right before us every day, is the overreach of a wannabe authoritarian. He is definitely displaying authoritarian behavior. He's attempting to cast doubt on the election. There is a major misinformation and disinformation campaign happening. We have people every day asking us, should we mail in our ballots? Should we drop our ballots off? Should we just stand in line and vote? I mean, just think about this. In our attempt to try and mitigate harm in a global pandemic, we all thought we should do absentee ballot. And the response of the president is to try and cast doubt and aspersion and interrupt the mailing system. So ballots that are legally cast via the processes that have been set up for years, people can't even trust it. So I think it's really important for us in movement spaces, obviously to do our part, but it's important for the media to keep shining the light on the real folks who must make a choice that literally is on behalf of everyone. It is not the lack of Black voters that cost these elections. It is white women voters who continue to vote for these kinds of elected officials. It is white evangelicals who continue to be seduced and deceived by a false gospel that continue to support this kind of wickedness. The burden should not be on Black people to save this democracy when we are the minority in this country. Now, of course, we're going to do what we do because we got to do what we do because our literal lives are on the line. So the movement's responsibility is to carry our water, to carry our weight. And we're doing that. There's major coordinated efforts all across the country, getting people registered to vote, getting people to turn out to vote, getting people to make sure they have the proper information. We have this great partnership with vote.org that has helped us to build an online voting registration tool, an absentee ballot tool. You can even check your status by going to vote.org or blackchurchrocks.com. We're doing everything we can, but at the end of the day, this is really about how will white folks show up in this election? How will you convert and compel your friends and family members in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia and Florida? How will Latinos show up in this election? Will you be seduced by the false promises of this Trump administration? Will you be deceived by the very thin kind of theological disinformation being fed to you in your pulpits by misinformed and myopic evangelical preachers and pastors? It's really important for folks to look in the mirror and ask themselves, what is our responsibility to save this democracy? Black folks are always going to do what we do. We are the most loyal voting base against white supremacy in the history of this country. We always vote against white supremacy. 90% of us are very clear about what's at stake. It's time for the rest of the country to catch up with Black women and Black voters who demonstrate for hundreds of years where our priorities are. That's against white supremacy. We'll do that in November for sure.
Thank you, Mike. And looking ahead, Ben, I know you talked about this a little bit already with the Bring the Heat campaign, but what are a few of the other biggest changes that you think we need to see right now immediately to police departments around the country if we want to create safer communities? Like, are there any specific reforms or policies that are being considered right now that really stand out to you?
Yeah, well, certainly, I think on the national level, the Justice and Policing Act is a great place to start. It is a terrible place to finish, but it's a great place to start. I think the banning of no-knock warrants and chokeholds and the way that those kind of brutal tactics have been deployed in departments across the country, those things have to stop. So Justice and Policing Act is a great way for us to start. The only way we even get the chance to pass that is we're going to have to win, from and knock these Republicans out of office at the federal level so that we can get the Justice and Policing Act. And certainly we have to remove the fascist in chief that is standing against, all of the kinds of changes in safety that Black and brown people, indigenous people, folks who are vulnerable need. And I think also we have to recognize that when we're really thinking about dealing with police is a very local experience. And so there are 18,000 police departments across the country. And if you're going to do something about policing, you're going to have to do it not just at the national level, but at the state level and at the local level. And so one of a couple things that we're putting forward, joining a chorus of others, is one, it has not been legislated in the United States of America for the last 200 and something years of policing in this country that you cannot be a racist and be a police officer. That has never been the law. And even though we know that the FBI has been saying from years during the Obama administration that white supremacist groups and explicit racists have been infiltrating police departments for decades. And so we need our mayors, our city councils, our local police chiefs to come up with a plan. And we are calling for them to do this across the country, to make the public pledge that you will fire all racist cops. The notion that somebody, just because they are a cop, is not a racist is absurd. You can have racist mailmen, you can have racist construction people, but somehow if you put on a blue uniform, you lose all racist, sensibilities. No. So we're calling on them to come up with a plan by which they will surveil the people that are working in their departments, that they will bring the full resources of the city to their local department to look for any explicit and overt expressions of racism in these online Facebook groups and in these secret groups that are happening on the dark internet, and expose these individuals and have a zero tolerance for racists being in these police departments. Now, the next stage.
And if you can't get your mayor, your police chief, your police union to make that kind of commitment, you need to ask them why.
Right.
You need to ask them why. We have chiefs and police officers right now reaching out to clergy all across the country for this event called Faith in Blue. And they want to sit down and eat hot dogs. They want to go to barbecues. They want to play sports. I'm telling you, you should not sit down with a police chief or a police captain if they're unwilling to make a commitment that we are going to scour our police department and get rid of racist, homophobes, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim officers with tattoos that connect them to the Proud Boys, neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, and the alt-right, the Boogaloo Boys. These individuals we know are in our departments. We know they're proximal to police officers. So if your chief and if your mayor won't publicly make a commitment to do that, you must ask them why. Tell them I'm not sitting down talking to you about no barbecue. I'm not talking to you about no sports programs, playing football with my child at 12 noon. I want to know, do you have individuals on your police department that at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, when they don't know them and I'm not around as the preacher to be looking over your shoulder, will you slow your roll down and not shoot them dead or beat them up in the course of an arrest because you are in fear for your life or because you have a racial animus towards Black, brown, LGBTQ, Muslim, immigrant populations? These kind of baselines, these kind of demands, we must make universal across this country. And any police chief and mayor that won't make that pledge, you must ask them why. Ask them why and wait for an answer.
And then on top of what Mike is saying, we also then need to, the big steps that we're going to need to take, two of those I want to highlight. One is dealing with and ending qualified immunity. This notion that police officers get some extra constitution that we don't all get, that they get to shoot people and kill folks and have no accountability, has to be ended. And that can begin at the state level. That doesn't need to begin at the federal level. So we need to begin in our movements to begin to bring legislation at the state level, wherever it is that we live, to end qualified immunity for law enforcement at the state level. The other thing that we need to do, and we just tried to pass this in California where we live, and we were unsuccessful, again, because of milquetoast progressive politicians. I'm trying not to turn my preacher voice on, but man, this thing just gets me so upset because we had on the ballot something to decertify law enforcement when they have demonstrated themselves as being abusive and violent and breaking the law. We should be able to decertify them so they can no longer go get a police job at another department. But we had not people on the right that resisted this alone, but people who call themselves progressives, who believe that that's a bridge too far. We need to continue to put pressure on our elected officials, regardless as to what party they're in, to tell them if you are going to be complicit in a policing structure where individuals get to shoot people and break the law in our community in the name of me, right? When the case comes against somebody in the court, it is the people versus this person. So you're not going to commit this kind of brutality in my name. We need to pass decertification laws across the country so that once a police officer breaks the law, they can no longer get a job in policing anywhere in the country. We need to pass that at the national level. We need to build a national database that ensures that we can keep track on where these individuals are engaging. And again, I want to say, and our folks in the movement know this is not the end result. This is just where we need to begin, right? But we have to begin. These are some of the reforms that we can begin to work on. And then at the local level, everybody needs to be demanding that your mayor, your city council, and your police chief sit down with the people and listen to the way in which we want to make changes to the current policing system while we are working on these long-term transformative actions that we need to make. If they won't sit down with you, if they won't implement what you say, they are demonstrating that you live not in a democracy, but in an autocracy. And if the police are going to act as autocratic leaders where we live, then we should be ready to engage in the kind of nonviolent direct action that threatens their ability to do so.
It's also important. Thank you so much, Ben. So we're sadly need to start wrapping this conversation up. But maybe on a lighter note, I have one last question for you both. I'm curious, what's it like working so closely together as brothers? Do you have any sibling rivalry going on?
I just want to be like him when I grow up.
And I want to have all the bass in his voice. I have the treble and he has the bass. So I have a sibling jealousy of his voice, but really, you know, this work is hard. It's demoralizing. It beats our souls up, and so being able to work with my brother by blood is definitely a blessing because I don't have to worry about his loyalty and his honesty and his critique. And his correction when I am trying to do the work to be most faithful. But I do believe as a follower of Jesus that the family of our churches, our communities, they transcend blood. They transcend name and race and gender and sexual orientation. We are a human family. And so I hope that we, as Ben talks about so powerfully, we can create a culture of belonging these or beyond these kind of distinctions. But until then, we'll certainly have to work with trusted comrades, and Ben is certainly one of my most trusted comrades.
Well, just so y'all know, you know, I paid him with Skittles and before we got on the call to make sure that he gave me such a great credential. But yeah, on a serious note, I mean, I'm not in this work if it's not for my brother. You know, this was not the track that I was trying to go down. For those who know me, I had another plan in mind, but you know, my brother knew that I was concerned about the violence and I was concerned about what was happening. And he saw in me at a time when I didn't see it in myself, the capacity to make a contribution to the story in a way that could really be meaningful. And the reason I think that's important is because all of us are in relationship with people who need us to see in them the capacity to do more than what they currently see within themselves. And my brother is humble, but he's done this all around the country with brothers like Desmond Meade down there in Florida, who turned that state around and restored the right to vote for 1.4 million Floridians. Mike met Desmond when folks didn't want to resource Desmond, and brought support to the work that Desmond was doing to get the Florida rights restored. And we are just two people among a chorus of thousands of others who are doing this work every day in cities, but they oftentimes don't get named. And so I think it's a privilege to be able to work alongside him, to support the vision and the work that he's continued to do. And our hope, I think, is that we can just continue to make more siblings, make more brothers, more sisters, more relatives across different, so that we can really change this society. The easy work has been done. The next level of pioneering that we need to do to get this country to another part of the story is ours to do.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you so much, Mike. This has been such a great conversation. We covered so much ground. I really, really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having us, and follow our work and support the kind of work of people all across the country like us. The key to changing our communities is the people have an imagination far beyond what we have today. So thanks for giving us a chance to spread some good news.
Thank you.
Totally. And thanks everyone who tuned in today with us. You can rewatch this conversation on whatever platform you're currently on: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or at motherjones.com. I'm Samantha Michaels for Mother Jones. I'll catch you next time.